In the winter seasons, you are warm without having to do much. The temperature can be adjusted as desired when inside a room. When you leave the room, you have a coat hanging by the door. But if you strip away all of that, you are left with bare skin and a winter cold enough before you even realize you are dying. With a body like that, without fur, without a thick layer of fat, unable to hibernate like bears, unable to walk south like reindeer, humans should have been one of the first things to disappear when the Ice Age arrived. Yet here we are. And not because of luck, not because the climate took pity on us, not because we found a place warm enough to wait for spring. The real reason is stranger than what you think, and directly related to everything you think you know about humans. It was never just one thing. It was an entire system built piece by piece in the darkness of the Ice Age, each piece solving a problem without which there would be death. You are the proof that that system worked. Let us see how they built it. But before talking about that system, you need to understand what they were facing. Because calling it winter is completely wrong. Winter is when you put on more clothes and wait for it to pass. What our ancestors faced was a geological epoch. The last glacial maximum lasted from 26,500 to 19,000 years ago. Massive ice sheets covered all of northern Europe, from the British Isles all the way to Moscow. Sea levels were 120 meters lower than today. European forests turned into flat, empty tundra with nothing to block the wind. Trees were extremely rare. Food disappeared for months on end. Temperatures were only 7 to 10 degrees Celsius lower than today. It sounds small, but enough to turn the entire Mediterranean region into semi-desert. But this was not even the scariest part. The scariest part is that this had happened before, and we had lost. Research by Marguerite and colleagues in the journal Science in 2023, analyzing ocean sediment cores off the coast of Portugal, shows that around 1,127,000 years ago, a similar cold period had occurred. The response of prehistoric people was completely consistent and completely catastrophic. Europe was empty of people for 200,000 years straight, not a population decline, completely empty. Now look at the animals that survived those ice ages without doing anything special. Mammoths had thick fur and fat under the skin enough to withstand deep sub-zero temperatures. Cave bears hibernated, slowing their metabolism down to near zero and waiting for warm seasons without needing to eat or drink anything. Reindeer simply walked hundreds of kilometers south and returned when summer came without needing a plan, just instinct. Humans had none of those. No fur, no fat reserves, unable to hibernate, no migration instinct. Strip the clothes off a person in real cold, and they only have a few hours, not a few days. The body shuts down, and that is it. People had known how to use animal skins from at least 300,000 years ago, known through the characteristic cut marks on bare foot bones in exactly the positions needed to skin them cleanly. But loose skins left heat escaping through every gap at the neck, at the arms, at the feet. Warm enough for a cool night, not enough for an ice age that wanted to kill you. So here is the real question. If the cold period 1.1 million years ago was strong enough to completely wipe prehistoric people from Europe for 200,000 years, why did the cold period 26,500 years ago not do the same to us? The answer begins with something so counterintuitive it sounds wrong. They did not run. The entire biological logic of mammals when the Ice Age came was to retreat south, find warmer places, escape uninhabitable zones. Red foxes retreated to Iberia. Deer concentrated in southern refugia. Lynx disappeared from the north. That is basic logic. When the environment becomes uninhabitable, you go where it is habitable. But research by Garcia Rodriguez and colleagues at Bournemouth University in 2024, examining the genetic history of 23 species of mammals in Europe, found one surprising group. Brown bears and wolves did not retreat anywhere. They were distributed widely across Europe, even at the peak of the Ice Age, remaining across the entire continent. And Homo sapiens belonged to this group. Genetic evidence shows our ancestors did not retreat south, they stayed. That sounds impressive until you remember brown bears have thick fur, thick fat under the skin, and strong metabolism. Wolves have double fur that blocks wind and retains heat. We had none of those. So with what did we manage to do what biologically we were not equipped to do? And this is when the story has real stakes. Neanderthals were also in Europe during that Ice Age. Larger, stronger brains, not smaller, and had lived in Europe for hundreds of thousands of years before our ancestors arrived. If anyone had a survival advantage in European Ice Age conditions, it should have been Neanderthals. But they disappeared. One of the reasons archaeological evidence points to is clothing. There is no evidence Neanderthals had bone needles with eye holes. Homo sapiens did. A small bone needle could be part of the reason one species survived and the other did not. Not everyone solved the cold with technology. The Yagan people in the far south of South America lived in near-freezing conditions, almost without clothing. Their bodies adapted over generations, running hotter, producing more internal heat, using a squatting posture to tuck in limbs and reduce heat loss area. Their answer was not a coat, but turning the body up higher. And there is one more possibility science has not conclusively settled. At the Cima de los Huesos site in Spain, bones of ancient human ancestors 430,000 years old show cyclical damage growth, stopping and restarting, prolonged lack of sunlight, along with patterns matching hibernating animals. Scientists suggest these people may have slowed their bodies into deep sleep to wait out winter. Not confirmed, still debated, but serious enough not to dismiss. So those who stayed, who did not run and did not hibernate, what did they use? But before talking about the things they used, let us stop at one number, because this number completely changes the way you look at the entire story. This is not a story about a powerful species overcoming a challenge. This is a story about a species that almost did not make it through, with just enough people surviving to tell the tale. Research by Hu and colleagues published in Science in 2023, analyzing the genomes of 3,154 modern people from many different populations worldwide, using the newly developed FitCol method. The results show that Homo sapiens ancestors experienced an extremely severe population bottleneck, with only about 1,280 breeding individuals remaining, lasting from around 930,000 to 813,000 years ago. That is 117,000 years straight. Ancestor population dropped from around 100,000 down to around 1,000 individuals, a reduction of more than 98.7%. Near extinction in the literal sense. Let that number sink in a bit. 1,280 people. Not 1.28 million. Not 128,000. 1,280 breeding individuals were all that remained of our species for 117,000 years. All 8 billion people living on the planet today are descendants of that tiny group. Every person you have ever met, every person whose name you have ever heard, all come from that same group of 1,280 people standing on the brink of extinction for more than 100,000 years. But here is what most people overlook when hearing this number. This is not bad news. This is proof that the survivors were not random. 117,000 years is long enough for the harshest natural selection imaginable to do one thing, eliminate everything unnecessary, and keep only one thing. Not thick fur, because we still do not have thick fur. Not fat reserves, because we still do not have blubber like seals. Not the ability to hibernate, because we still cannot hibernate. What was kept was the ability to look at a problem that had never existed before and create something to solve it. The Ice Age did not try to kill us, it just could not. So what did that retained thing look like in reality? If you want the most specific, most physical, most indisputable evidence of what our ancestors did during the Ice Age, here it is. Kostenki 11, a site near the Don River in Russia, about 300 kilometers south of Moscow. There, archaeologists found a circle with a diameter of 12 meters still existing after 24,000 years. Not a stone circle, not a wood circle. The circle was built from 64 mammoth skulls and 51 lower jaws. DNA analysis in 2024 by Ray Iglesias and colleagues confirmed the bones came from many generations of different mammoths collected deliberately over time, not from a single hunt. The construction technique was detailed to an astonishing level. Skulls and large leg bones were driven into the ground as foundations. Ribs and tusks were bent upward as load-bearing frames. Hundreds of bones in a single house. The entire structure was partially pressed into the ground, then stuffed with animal skins, moss and dirt into the gaps to retain heat. The largest of these was about 18,000 years old, right in the coldest phase of the entire Ice Age, and the site was reused many times over hundreds of years. This was not a temporary camp of people on the run. This was a community with a fixed address returning to the same place generation after generation. But not just the building materials, but also the interior design showed the level of their technical thinking. Many winter houses had entrances dug lower than the sleeping area, a passive cold air trap. Cold air is heavier, so it sinks and stays in the entrance area, while warm air rises and accumulates in the living area above. They discovered this physical principle tens of thousands of years before anyone wrote it down as a formula. And snow, which you think is the enemy, turned out to be an ally. piling thick snow walls around the shelter and inside could maintain near 0 degrees Celsius even when outside was minus 30 degrees. Long before anyone perfected the igloo, people knew that lying under a pile of snow was much warmer than standing outside in the wind. The shocking point was not the size of the structure, but the logic behind it. When there was no more wood, no large enough stones, no familiar building materials, people looked around and saw prey bones. Then they built houses from them. This was not a panicked reaction of desperate people. This was systematic engineering thinking in apocalyptic conditions. How many generations of observation testing failure did it take to invent mammoth-bone architecture combined with cold air traps at minus 30 degrees? And who paid the price for the failures in that process? But the mammoth-bone house only solved half the problem. You could stay inside all day, but sooner or later you had to go outside. And when going outside, what stood between you and death was not bone walls, it was fire. Nothing worked without fire. That was where everything began, and if it was missing, every other solution was meaningless. Fire was not just for warmth. Fire cooked food, hardened spear tips, added many usable hours of light when the Ice Age winter sun barely rose above the horizon. And when wood ran out on the empty treeless tundra, people burned animal fat and bones as substitutes. Bones burn and under some conditions produce longer-lasting heat than wood. Evidence for this comes from research by Murphy and colleagues published in Geoarchaeology in 2025, analyzing 3 hearths at the Korman 9 site in Ukraine, dated 22,000 to 21,000 years ago. Micromorphology and colorimetric analysis showed these open flat hearths, used mainly spruce wood, had reached temperatures exceeding 600 degrees Celsius in the soil below. The excavators expected to find crude small fires, traces of people trying to survive the night. Instead, they found carefully built hearths with sophisticated temperature control. This was not survival fire, this was thermal engineering. But here is the paradox no one has a satisfactory answer for. Korman 9 is one of the very few pieces of evidence of fire during the entire peak of the last glacial maximum. Before the Ice Age and after the Ice Age, evidence of fire appears everywhere in the European archaeological record. But during the coldest phase from 26,500 to 19,000 years ago, there is almost nothing. Why? There are 3 hypotheses. Permafrost thawing in cycles had destroyed all traces. Lack of wood fuel on the empty tundra made fire rare. Or people did not use fire as much as we think, but relied on other parallel solutions alongside fire. None of the hypotheses is fully confirmed. All 3 may be partly right. But if fire was not the only thing that saved them, or not just fire, then what? The answer lies in an invention so small it sounds ridiculous when called the most important in human history. That invention was a needle. At the Kammengrubengraben site in Lower Austria, one of the rare open-air sites in Europe that preserved a large collection of stoneworks, organic items, jewelry and animal remains from the last glacial maximum around 24,000 to 20,000 years ago, archaeologists noticed something unusual in the pile of animal bones. Research by Pastor and colleagues published in the Journal of Paleolithic Archaeology in 2025 shows that animal remains here were almost absolutely dominated by reindeer Rangifer tarandus. What is notable is that older Gravettian sites in the same area, dated 33,000 to 29,000 years ago, were mainly mammoth bones. But by the last glacial maximum, mammoths had almost disappeared from the dinner table of people, at that time not because mammoths disappeared from the area, but because people had deliberately chosen reindeer as a replacement. Why? The evidence lies in a small detail that says it all. Reindeer skulls found at the site still had antlers intact, meaning the animal was killed in winter before antlers shed, according to the seasonal cycle. They did not hunt reindeer in winter because reindeer meat tasted better than mammoth meat. They hunted in winter because winter reindeer fur was the best insulating material. Nature produced thicker, lighter, and more effective at retaining warmth than any other type of animal fur available in that environment. Hunting was no longer the only priority for food. They hunted to wear. And this is when the needle appeared. Bone needles with eye holes, a thin piece of bone or ivory with a small hole drilled through one end, appeared simultaneously across Europe around 23,000 years ago. Epigravettian in Eastern Europe, Badagulian in Western Europe, Kammengrubengraben in Austria, all at the same time. Not one place inventing it, and the idea spreading gradually to others. It was parallel invention, many groups of people in places thousands of kilometers apart, arriving at the same solution under the same survival pressure. One scientist called the eyed bone needle perhaps the most important invention in human history, and he was right. Before the needle, animal skins were just loose coverings. With the needle you had real clothing. Sealed seams, multiple layers, sleeves tight at the wrists, hoods fitting snugly, boots fully enclosing the feet. A loose skin over the shoulders and a well-fitted set of sewn clothing create completely different results when temperatures drop to -30 degrees. The needle was what turned one into the other, and there is no evidence that Neanderthals had eyed bone needles. Homo sapiens did. In a winter cold enough that difference was not a small advantage. It was the boundary between existence and extinction. The first industrial revolution of the human species was not steam. It was not electricity. It was the needle. But the needle was only one piece of something much larger. There was no single trick that saved them. Not fire alone. Not the bone house alone. Not well-fitted sewn clothing alone. It was an entire ecosystem of solutions, and each solved a problem without which there would be death. Fire provided sophisticated temperature control, allowing cooking and warmth inside. The mammoth-bone house with cold air trap at the entrance retained heat even when outside was -30 degrees. Well-fitted clothing from winter reindeer-fur allowed activity outside without freezing to death. But there were also less mentioned things. Before going out to hunt, they smeared tallow-rendered animal fat on their faces and necks to seal the skin and prevent wind from pulling away body heat. Simple, a bit gross, and completely effective. On white snow under the winter sun, reflected light could cause temporary blindness for a few hours, a disaster when hunting far from home. Their solution was to carve thin slits into bone or wood and tie them over the eyes. The first eyeglasses of the human species made from bone invented tens of thousands of years before anyone thought of glass. For food, when they hunted large prey, they did not just eat and discard the rest. The cold froze the meat right after the hunt for use many months later. They smoked it, dried it into jerky, stored it in ground pits and underground cellars. There is evidence of submerging mammoth meat in cold ponds to keep it fresh and natural refrigerator without electricity. At one site in eastern France near high limestone cliffs, hunters used fire and group coordination to drive entire herds of wild horses and reindeer into natural traps, not once but over tens of thousands of years at the same spot, generation after generation, killing many, smoking the meat, storing it for the coming cold season. And when all of that was still not enough, when winter dragged on too long and food was completely depleted, there is evidence that some people practiced cannibalism to survive. Not out of savagery, but out of the absolute will to survive, with no exceptions. This is what all this evidence is telling us. Everything that defines Homo sapiens, abstract thinking, large-scale cooperation, technological innovation, intergenerational transmission of knowledge, did not appear in comfortable conditions. They appeared when the price of not inventing them was death tonight. Pressure created humans, not the other way around. The Ice Age was the harshest invention teacher natural history has ever created. But all the things just mentioned, fire, the bone house, sewn clothing, food storage, tallow, smeared on faces, bones, snow goggles, were things a single separate group of people could invent on their own. There was one more thing archaeological evidence points to, and that may be what truly made the difference between groups that survived and groups that disappeared without a trace. In the archaeological record of the last glacial maximum, researchers found a strange pattern. The same type of raw stone material appeared at sites hundreds of kilometers apart. The same style of bone needles with the same proportions and the same hole drilling technique appeared simultaneously in completely different geographic regions. The same leather processing technique with the same specific steps was found from Ukraine to Austria to Spain, 500 to 800 kilometers apart. It cannot be explained by random coincidence. It cannot be explained by independent invention because the technical details are too specific and similar to have only one common origin. This was a deliberate continent-wide knowledge-sharing network operating right in the coldest phase of the Ice Age. Think about what this really means. If one group in Ukraine discovered a better way to process reindeer fur, a new tanning technique that retained warmth more effectively in strong wind conditions, the group in Austria knew about it within one generation. No internet, no writing, no maps. Only people traveling between groups, meeting at seasonal gathering points and passing on by word of mouth what they had learnt to those they met. Knowledge traveled with people. And people traveled farther, more frequently, and more purposefully than anyone ever thought possible in Ice Age conditions. In an environment where one winter with worse techniques could wipe out an entire group with no one left to tell the tale, the ability to access the best available knowledge was not a competitive advantage. It was the difference between existing and completely disappearing from the archaeological record. They did not just survive together, they learnt together. And that is something no other animal in the Ice Age could do. But not everyone survived. And it is important to understand who did not make it through, because the answer says a lot. In Ice Age sites, evidence shows people slept together in spaces much smaller than any modern standard would accept, and that was not because they had no choice but deliberate. Human body heat is a real heat source when you pack enough people close enough together. A group of 8 people sleeping together in a small space produced significant heat without needing any additional fuel. People with their own space were not the lucky ones. They were colder and more likely to die. Often it was precisely the people living alone, especially the elderly, who died first in the harshest cold snaps, not because their bodies were weaker, but because there was no one beside them to share heat. And here is the bigger picture. The people who disappeared after the cold period 1,127,000 years ago left nothing behind. No names, no continuing tools, no traceable descendants, just absolute absence in the archaeological record, as if they had never existed. And even when the last glacial maximum ended, the story was not over. Research by Crombie and colleagues in Scientific Reports in 2024, analyzing 33 radiocarbon samples from Rimouchamp's cave in Belgium, recorded what happened around 12,850 years ago when people thought they had escaped. A second unexpected cold snap arrived the Younger Dryas extremely cold and wet, lasting until around 11,650 years ago. The population in the southern North Sea region declined significantly. Recovery only from around 12,200 years ago, when summers became a bit warmer. Twice they thought they had escaped, twice they were pulled back. So what was the difference between those who survived both times and those who did not? Not luck, not superior genes, but what they had done, what they had learnt, and what they had beside them, specifically other people who knew things they did not. And here is the biggest paradox of this entire story. When the last glacial maximum ended 19,000 years ago, the survivors did not just continue living as before. They exploded. Populations surged. In the few thousand years after that, agriculture appeared independently in many places around the world at the same time. Art flourished. The first cities formed. Civilization started at a speed never seen before in all of previous human history. Why did all of that happen right after the Ice Age ended, and not before, not during hundreds of thousands of years of more stable conditions? Not because the warming climate created easier conditions, but because the people who stepped out of the last glacial maximum were no longer the same species that had stepped into it. 117,000 years of maximum pressure had created a completely different kind of human. A species that knew how to sew well-fitted clothing from winter reindeer fur, knew how to build houses from whatever materials were available around, whether mammoth bones or stone or wood, knew how to store food for months with nothing to hunt, knew how to share techniques across hundreds of kilometers with people they had never met directly, and knew how to trust each other enough to do all of that together, not just within family or tribe, but in a much wider network. They were never caught off guard by winter. Their entire year was built around preparing for it. Winter was not something that arrived and they had to react. Winter was the center of every plan, every decision, every investment of time and effort from the beginning of the year. That was strength, not a burden, and that strength was built through tens of thousands of years of failure, learning, and passing on to the next generation. Those who survived and those who did not survive did not differ biologically. They differed in what they had done, what they had learnt, who they had beside them, and what they had prepared. That was not luck. That was choices accumulated and passed down through many generations until it became second nature. Winter never ending was not what killed us, it was what created us. Everything you consider characteristic of modern humans, the ability to plan long-term, cooperate with strangers, innovate when there are no resources, trust in networks wider than immediate family, all were forged in the darkness of the Ice Age, not in the comfort of spring. So let us return to that winter night. -30 degrees. The wind did not stop. Winter had dragged on for thousands of years, and there was no sign it would stop. Somewhere in that darkness, someone decided to stay. Not because they were not afraid, not because they knew everything would be okay, but because there was no better choice and they did the only thing they could do. They sewed one more stitch into the fur coat when their hands were almost numb. They piled more mammoth bones onto the wall when wood had run out long ago. They called the people in the group closer, not out of affection, but because of temperature. They remembered what people from another tribe taught them the previous summer and applied it tonight in the darkness and the cold. No names, no faces, no records. But there were genes, and those genes are running in you right now. Let that number sink in one more time. 1,280 people. Not a few million, not a few 100,000. 1,280 breeding individuals were all that remained of our species for 117,000 years. Every person reading or hearing this is a direct descendant of that group. No exceptions. All 8 billion people on this planet, every person you have ever met, every person whose name you have ever heard, all come from that same tiny group. What does that really mean? It means that every time in those 117,000 years, there was someone in the group of 1,280 who thought about giving up. There was someone else who did not give up. Every time winter was cold enough to kill the whole group, enough people did enough things right, so that some people lived through that night, then the next night, then the next winter, then the next century, not broken once in 117,000 years. That chain runs straight from them to you, without interruption. And what was the result of that uninterrupted chain? In just a few thousand years after the last glacial maximum ended a period of time that is nothing compared to the 117,000 years they endured, these people went from stacking mammoth bones into houses to building pyramids. From sewing reindeer fur with bone needles to weaving cloth, from remembering techniques by mouth to writing them down and passing them to people not yet born. They defeated winter so completely that most people have forgotten it was once a war we were losing. The next time you feel pressure bearing down from all sides and see no way out, remember that the pressure was once much greater than this. And your ancestors did not find a way out. They did not run south. They did not wait for spring. They built a house right in the middle of that pressure, with mammoth bones, at -30 degrees. And they lived through that night, then the next night, then the next 117,000 years, until you were born. If you think the story of these people who refused to be erased by the Ice Age deserves to be known by more people, please subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next stories about our ancestors who did the unimaginable so that you could be here today. Every subscription is a way of saying that stories like this matter, and we will continue to tell them.